I don't know a lot about it, but he's been telling me some of the things. I know there's certain things like in the Bible, in movies, in books that are no longer there. You know, the movie Apollo where they say Houston, that's no longer in the movie. No copy. And where Forrest Gump has he says the box of chocolates, and he says life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. It no longer says that. It says life is a box of chocolates, and that's it. And then in the Bible where it says the lamb shall lie down with the lion, that's not there anymore. It's not in any copy. It has something to do with, the name came from Nelson Mandela and the discrepancy about his birthday, his death date, but I'm not too familiar with the dates. But anyway, Phil's going to talk about that. It's very interesting. It has to do with CERN, you know, the big, what do you call it?
Atom smasher.
No,
Hadron collider.
Hadron
Well,
collider.
it's evidently, Phil thinks we have moved into a quantum reality. And that things have changed. So many, many things have changed. So anyway, you can look it up on the internet. I was going to pass these out. I think we might have enough.
I got a question. What is the cutoff date on that Mandela?
I can't hear you very well. So
What is the cutoff date on that Mandela Effect? When did it start?
cutoff date for what?
The
When did it
Mandela
start?
Effect.
When did it start?
I don't know.
Do you have an idea?
People started
Maybe y'all
noticing
can share
when
one.
Mandela
Have
died
enough to
the
go
second
around.
time. That's when people started noticing.
Okay.
So
This is a
2000
copy
something.
of an article by Lawrence Gardner that I wanted to tell a little bit about.
She just said
And,
copy
it was in,
Lawrence Gardner.
in Nexus. And you can now get Nexus in the U.S. again.
We go
But
get it.
I think it's $26 for a year. It's 6 copies. And I'm telling you, there is nothing to touch it so far as the leading edge of everything.
That's right.
And so I recommend getting it. So anyway, you know a lot about my taking my, if anybody is missing a last sheet,
Everybody's what?
the last sheet of this article, let me know because I had one extra copy.
What is the last sheet?
You know, I took those groups to France and to Rennes le Chateau, and there was so much history there, and it was so fascinating to me. And this article kind of touches on that. Well, you remember that there was a priest
Robin, I've
at a
only got
tiny
5.
church.
5 pages.
5 pages.
What?
5.
I've got 5
What?
also.
5.
You're missing? Okay.
Well,
Here you are.
is it supposed to be
How
6?
many pages are we
What?
supposed to
How
have?
many pages?
I don't know. You have the end.
1,
What does it look like?
2. Okay, that's
I
the
don't know.
last
You
page.
can
3, 4.
You can see if it goes to the end.
25 is the last page.
Anyway, one of the
Okay.
things that the priest
You got enough
discovered,
pages, Jerry.
it was a tiny church
too.
in a little tiny place that wasn't even on most maps. Very, very primitive. And no running water down the mountain, 1,700-foot mountain, no running water, no roads, no nothing. So this priest was assigned there. And he was trying to renovate the church, which was built in the 6th century. And he discovered some documents in some pillars, and they were obviously in code. And he showed them to different priests and couldn't decide what to do with them. Eventually, he took them to to Paris, to the Church of Saint Sulpice. If you remember, that was in the DaVinci Code.
Right.
And the DaVinci Code danced around this story. And so whatever, when they translated these things and decoded them, nobody knows everything that was in them. But he became this poor parish priest at this tiny village to a multimillionaire overnight.
Uh-oh.
So whatever it was some explosive information. And he built some big, a big villa there. He remodeled the church in a very strange way. And he built a tower to Mary Magdalene. So one of the things that they think came out of it is that Mary Magdalene and Jesus were married. Well, this would be an explosive thing for the church, for it to come out in public, proof of that. It would destroy the Catholic Church because they based everything on the male dominance. And so when Mary Magdalene came to France, she was one of the disciples of Jesus. And what this article says, and this is what my research is born out, is that Jesus survived the crucifixion. And there's different stories about where he went. One book that I've researched that links says that he went to India and studied a great deal. Some of it says he came back to France and met Mary Magdalene there, and that they had children. And you know, I met a lot of these French people, and you know how, if you know the typical French person, they're very rigid with their Catholicism, but only in their left brain. In their right brain, they'll tell you all about Jesus and Mary Magdalene being married and their children and where they grew up and what happened to them and everything. So it's interesting. But anyway, so Lawrence Gardner, you'll see this in this article. He was Britain's Grand Prior of the Sacred Kindred of St. Columbia, the royal ecclesiastical seat of the Celtic Church. He had access to the Celtic Church records that go back to AD 37.
Wow.
And then he was hired by all these families to do their genealogies, and he's very famous with that. Chronological accounts of things that these families knew the substance of but didn't know the detail of. So as he started researching it, he found out that a lot of these documents go back very, very early, and some had not even been opened or read in thousands of years. So he started seeing all this stuff about the bloodlines and about Jesus and Mary Magdalene being married. And it seemed that this was common knowledge among all these families. And it was common knowledge among many of the groups. And so, I've given you this article so you can check this out. But
What was the name of the book he wrote, Robin? Do you remember?
He wrote
when they selected books for the Bible, originally they were going to be only books
I have
that
it, but
were
I've forgotten what it was.
Jesus'
one is Holy
own-
Grail, Holy something. He's
Disciple.
written
Holy Grail?
He's written 3 books. I still have them.
It
Holy
says here,
Holy Grail.
Bloodline of the
But-
Holy Grail.
Say
Bloodline
what?
of the Holy Grail.
Some of the
Bloodline of the Holy
books in the
Grail.
Bible were not
I've
written
reached
by his
21.
disciples, and some that were written by his disciples were like the Gospel of Thomas. Thomas was not only a disciple, some people say he was Jesus' twin, but the Gospel of Thomas has now been found and published. And some of these things differ a great deal from what the Bible says. So, when they saw that women were very much a part of all this early teaching, the church had to do something about that. So they excluded anything that had to do with women. And women, of course, were not allowed to speak in the church. St. Paul said that a man should be married and should have children, and that priests should be. Well, so Mary Magdalene, when she came to France, she was a revered disciple. And so the church had to do something about that. So they put Mary Magdalene down as much as possible to subliminate her. And they exalted the Virgin Mary and made up a lot of stories about her that weren't even true, that she was born of a virgin herself and so on and so on. So the Virgin Mary has been exalted more and more and more, simply as a saint and as a celibate saint. And the history of Mary Magdalene, who was a wife and lover of Jesus. So now there are things that have come out, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran, it says that Jesus liked to kiss Mary Magdalene on the mouth very often, and the disciples didn't like that. And they said, "Why do you love her more than you love us?" And so on and so on. Anyway, the church was so frightened that it instituted a rule of celibacy for their priests. And a law in 1135 that persists to this day. And they the priests couldn't have any contact with women, because women become wives and lovers, and then you get a bloodline, you get children, and you get a bloodline. And they couldn't have that. So this is about the bloodline of Jesus. And it seems that this was very well known and very well published in a lot of the early writings. And so this is why the Bible was forbidden to be read for so many years. Originally the Greek, and then they translated it into Latin. Well, it was a very difficult form of Latin, what I think they called Caesarean Latin, but very difficult. So unless you'd been trained as a priest to read that kind of Latin, you couldn't read the Bible and wouldn't understand it. And so in the 16th century, this William Tyndale was strangled, executed, and then burned for translating the Bible into English. And so all the English translations were forbidden. And even today they don't allow you to read, the Catholic Church doesn't allow you to read certain things. Anyway, I thought y'all would enjoy reading this article. So if anybody's missing the last page, it says page 23. Let me know, I've got an extra one.
25.
It's 25.
Huh?
25.
What?
It's 25, not 23. We got it.
23 is the
25.
I'm sorry, 25 is the missing page.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay. Okay. All right. I just want to mention a little bit about synchronicity. And synchronicity is something that is happening more and more to people today. And I want to give you just two little examples that are very personal to explain what happens. My oldest son, in 1975, was killed in a hang gliding accident. Well, he had been married in a big church wedding to a girl some years before, and she was pregnant. And when the baby was born, The baby was about 3 months old. His wife left him and moved to Memphis. And he said, "Mother, I don't think it's my baby. I think she went back to be with the guy that she dated before me." He said, "I don't think it's my child." So we just forgot about it. So some years later, when this baby was 15 years old, a series of synchronistic events happened within a 2-week period that were very curious. First thing happened, my daughter, they grew up in Birmingham, but she didn't go there very often, and she happened to be visiting, and she just happened to run into a girl she knew, who just happened to be a good friend of Robbie's wife that had the big wedding and that was pregnant and that ran off and left him. And so she showed Julie a picture of this child. Now, do you know anyone? Do you have a single friend that carries around pictures of their friends' children? Have you ever heard of anybody doing that? Ever?
Sometimes.
Well, she had a picture of this child who was now about 15, and she showed it to my daughter. And Julie came back and said, "Mother, there's no way that's not Robbie's child. She looks exactly like him and exactly like me, who looked a lot like Robbie." So we didn't know what to think. So, but within 2 weeks, a bunch of other things happened. It was very synchronistic. I got a call from a Canadian network television company that wanted to make a video of me. And they wanted to shoot it in Memphis, where she now lived. And of course I had no contact with her. And so okay, we made arrangements to do that. And I happened to have an old friend that lived there. And he said, well, I could stay with him. And he said also he would take me out to visit this child that I thought might now be my grandchild. So I went and we did the TV thing and all. And so he drove me out there. If I had not been able to stay with him, I would have stayed in a hotel, and I wouldn't have had the way to get to see them. They lived way out, and it would have been a great inconvenience. So anyway, he took me out to visit them. She was this lovely girl, and so anyway, then a couple of weeks later, we had now Robbie, my son, that had died, had now had 2 other children. So we had a sort of a family reunion up in Helen, and this child who is now 15 gets to come and meet her brother and sister, or half brother and sister. And so, where's Carol? So anyway, it was like we brought a new member of our family in, because she became very close to us all and came and visited a lot. She had another grandmother who lived here, and it was like we got a new member of the family. And it was just like 2 months before my second son died in a hang gliding accident. So it was like a very synchronistic event that was, meant to be. Okay, one other synchronistic event I wanted to tell you about. I used to work for a mortgage company here as a loan officer, and something I'd never done that type of thing in my life. But there was a lady there, and she told the story. She had lived in New York somewhere, and when she was a little girl, they had moved, and her mother had gotten rid of a lot of things. And she'd gotten rid of this beloved book that this child had. And the child just never gave up the grief and loss of this book, and she chided her mother all the time. Why did you give that away? That was my favorite book, and she loved it so, and so on and so on. Now, like 30 years later, she's living in Atlanta, working at the mortgage company with me, and she goes in this used bookstore, and there's this book, and it has her name in it.
That's just like
And so things like this happen all the time. I've got lots and lots of stories written up about this kind of synchronicity. Okay. Now, the next thing I was going to talk about is not a happy thing, really. Does anybody ever remember anything about Cathy Obrien?
Yes.
Anybody here ever read? Years ago, when David Icke was very new, and I don't think he'd even written his first book, and she had written this book, I sponsored both of them to come to Atlanta for the weekend. And so they were at the Global Mall, and we had a whole weekend of her talking about her experiences and David Icke talking about his early research. And there were about 50 people. And I don't think many people had heard of David Icke at that time. Anybody here not heard of David Icke? So, anyway, got to know them fairly well because they were here all weekend. And it was David Icke's introduction to mind control by meeting them. And so he left here with them and was going to Nashville, I think, where her daughter was more or less in car. Her little daughter, about 12 or 13, was being literally held prisoner in a home and getting no treatment or anything. And they went there to visit her, and I'll explain the circumstances of that in a minute. Okay, because I went to global sciences conferences for so many years and got to know so many cutting-edge people, she spoke there a number of times. And I got to know her and the man who rescued her from the CIA mind control MK Ultra program. And it's the most horrifying thing you could even imagine. She was a little girl, and her father was just an absolute creep. He was having sex with her. He was passing her around to his friends, charging them to have sex with her, taking photographs, videos of her, having sex with these people, sex with animals, everything, porno stuff that he was selling. And so she was 5 or 6 or something during this period, and her life was hell. And so the CIA comes to him, and he said, well, we've got you, buddy. We've got all the goods on you. And you'll go to prison. But you can avoid all this prosecution if you work with us. And so what they wanted to do was train him to be a handler. And he went along with that. And in this book, she's got his address, his name, and everything. He lives up in, they were very poor then. He lives up in the Hudson River area. He's very wealthy. And she gave his address, everything about him. And he was absolutely a monster. Wow. And so what he did, he had 5 more children that he could train to be part of this MK Ultra CIA program.
Goodness.
The CIA is the biggest dealer of pornography, prostitution, drugs, and even selling babies. And this is true. This is not something I'm just spouting that I've read on the internet. This is something that many of these people who were intimately involved in it told me personally. So, the way they make a mind-controlled slave is what they call trauma-based mind control. And a child is sexually abused, ritually abused, seen caused to participate in satanic rituals, sacrificial rituals where babies are killed,
Good Lord.
where animals are killed, all sorts of stuff. And children are subjected to that and the horrors of it. Every time a child is subjected to this or to torture, this is what the psychiatrists call disassociation. Actually, it's getting out of your body. And each time that would happen, they would be joined by what's called an alter. A multiple personality would be developed. And so some of these people have many, many personalities. And they're created deliberately, okay? By the CIA. They're created deliberately. And so I met many of these people at Global Sciences. This is another woman I got to know really, really well who lives in North Georgia. And her story is just as shocking, if not more shocking than Cathy's. Cathy was used by George Bush, the big George Bush.
Yeah.
She was raped, her daughter was raped by him. Her daughter was 10 years old. Her daughter was also a victim. She describes in detail how George Bush would take her daughter. They would have to have a special doctor that would treat the children because they would require surgery after being raped by an adult. She describes, I remember in the book, one particular thing where Cheney is there, and Cheney also raped her daughter, and where Big George takes her, they're in some special house, to a bedroom, and he turns around and comes back and asks Cheney to give him the spray bottle of cocaine. And Cheney sneers and says, "Oh, I didn't know you cared." And he said, "It's not for me, you idiot. It's not for them, it's for me. So I'll last longer." He said, "Besides, I like to see them squirm a little."
Oh dear.
Now this is the person who was president of the United States. And this is a true story. She told me herself. Okay, this woman had a daughter who's also named as Kelly, who was also raped by George Bush.
Oh.
Now, I hate to be telling y'all such negative, ugly stuff, but I feel like people need to know the truth about it.
Was this before?
And you have no idea how many thousands of people are victims.
I know, but what year was it, Robin?
What?
What year was this going on?
What year?
Yeah.
When he was president or after?
Before,
Well,
after, during?
It spans many years. This book was published in 95, and that's about when I first met her, or somewhere around, no, before that. I met them before they published this book.
Are you talking about
Okay,
George
the way
Bush?
she was,
George Bush
the way
Sr.?
she was
Yeah,
rescued
Big
from,
Bush
I
Sr.
can't hear you, Kathy. The way she was rescued from this program was an interesting, also synchronistic event. This man who had had a lot of exposure to the government and all these different programs somehow became a business partner of the person that Cathy was married to at first. And this was a huge multi-million-dollar deal that was going to take place with China funding. And so the three of them went to China first, and things were set up, and then he went back alone. And when he got over there, the Chinese people told him that there was several $1 million available for this invention. It was some kind of capacitors that they were going to sell. And but they said one thing is you have to get rid of your partner. And that was the one she was married to. He was a very, very dastardly character. And he said, well, how am I going to do that? And so he was skeptical because he hadn't had any much, time with this man. So he showed him a picture. He showed him a whole dossier, had a whole dossier on this man. And he was horrible. And they showed him a picture of him raping a little Haitian boy. And so after that, he believed him, and he went back, and so he contacted some people. By then, he realized that Cathy and her daughter were these victims of a terrible, terrible tragedy, and that they were being tortured and misused, and he wanted to help them. So he ditched the whole thing with China, that whole program, he ditched it. And he came back and he contacted certain people in the government that he had some high-level contacts on how to do it. And everybody advised him against it. They said, you'll wind up dead. But anyway, what he did is he wound up taking her, this man, her husband was out of town. He wound up taking her and her daughter to Alaska. And for some reason that seemed a safer place, and he had some experience in hypnosis and many techniques, and so he started to deprogram her. Well, these people are so enslaved by these techniques that they are in trance most of the time. They have no autonomy themselves. They are used for assassins. All these people have told me that they have been used as assassins. They're used as high-level prostitutes for presidential people and high-level politicians. They're used as drug mules. They're used as spies that cannot be compromised. A regular spy can be compromised with drugs and sex and money, right? These can't, because they are programmed in a certain way. So I took a course at Global Sciences one time from a man that had written a lot of books. He had a woman there with him that he had rescued. It was astonishing. He describes, he says, suppose this whole wall had cubby holes. It was little spots of cubby holes. And in each cubby hole was a personality stuffed in there. They call them altars until they're needed for certain things. They're programmed to do certain jobs. If you're trained to be an assassin, you stay in there until they do the code and you're pulled out and you do your job, and then you're wiped and you're put back in there and you're quiet until then. And if you're trained as a sexual slave, you're trained to the highest levels of sexual pleasures in different ways. Cathy had several different types of sexual programming. So even when she was 12 or 13, she was being used in different ways. And the Catholic Church was very involved in all this programming. They were complicit in it. At least the churches and the priests that she was involved with were. And so this woman's story is similar, except that her father was very, very high up in the hierarchy. Very high up. And he was also a monster. And these people loved to see these children tortured, and there were a lot of there's a lot of cases of, you probably hear things about ritual murders and ritual sacrifice and satanic things. Most of it is all involved with this. And it's a way of traumatizing and keeping these people under their control. The Mormon Church has a level of it, and I hope I'm not stepping on any toes, but I have a lot of documentation about this. Underneath the main Mormon temple in Utah is a series of tunnels and rooms that are used for human sacrifice and ritual murders and so on. And this is well documented. So at one Global Sciences that I went to, there were 5 people that had escaped from the Mormon Church that all came to me for help. And one of them was a couple, a very attractive couple. And they had been terrified to leave the church. They had moved to somewhere like Montana. And she said, from the time I was 6 years old until I was married, I was the love slave of Gordon Hinckley. He was the national president of the Mormon Church. Well, I got lots of other stories about him and all, but she said that she and her husband had 10 children. She said every single one of them were ritually and sexually abused in the basement of the Mormon temple in Utah, in the main Mormon temple in Salt Lake City. Every single one of them. And so she said that they were terrified in leaving the church. I had clients before this that left the church, and they were harassed horrendously by the Mormon Church just for leaving. And so some of them came to me for help. But these people were terrified. And then there were 4 other single people at that conference who had also left the church and had some similar stories. But this couple was very interesting, since she said she had been abused by them. She was his constant love slave from the time she was 6 years old until she got married. And then, of course, there are a lot of these stories about the polygamy thing, and there's that's a whole nother thing, but some of this is involved in that too. And it's horrendous. So a lot of people who are Mormons are very devout and have no idea what goes on. No idea. I've known some of them, I've had very good friends.
They still
So-
have that one fellow in jail, don't they, Robin?
What?
That one fellow that's a big leader in the church, they still have him in jail, don't they? I haven't read anything about him lately.
I don't know.
What's his name?
Oh, Gordon Hinckley?
No.
Is he high up in the church?
In that in one area, yes, for sure. They finally arrested him and put him in
Of course, this
prison.
made me very wary of Romney, because his family originally had been in polygamy. A couple of generations back, they had moved to Mexico, and there was polygamy in there. But the thing is that the Mormon Church that Mormon Church and the Catholic Church are 2 of the wealthiest entities in the world, and they would have had to have a lot of influence on Romney. So that was sort of worrying. I mean, he seemed a very nice person on the surface, but I wasn't really for him. But this is a book. Book that Raymond Moody lent me, and it's a study, earlier study of the CIA mind control, and this doctor, particularly this Dr. Cameron, who was a monster in Canada and I think the U.S. who was used in a lot of these. And then there's another book by them called The Mind Control of Candy Jones, I think. Well, some years ago, back in the 90s, we had a mind control conference at the Paramount. And I knew, I've been to mention when I brought Cathy Obrien to speak, the room was absolutely filled with mind control victims, mostly in recovery, with their advocates, their lawyers, and their therapists. The whole room was filled with those people. And some of those people were at this conference, and there were lawyers, and there were people that were very well known in the mind control thing. Around Ted Gunderson, you may have heard that name, was a speaker, and many people spoke, and it was. I'm surprised they've never had anything like that again. Sylvia Gillard was someone. Hearings, subcommittee hearings, all this came up at different times. Okay, when David Icke and Cathy Obrien and Mark Phillips, who rescued her, left here, they went to Tennessee to the place where her daughter was incarcerated. Not in a prison, but some kind of mental facility. They would not let her out until she was 18. They would only allow Cathy and Mark come and visit her, but she was not allowed any therapy or anything. And they went to court many times to try to get her freed, and there are documents in here that said neither Mark nor Cathy nor her daughter Kelly could testify in any court in the United States for any reason, for reasons of national security. Now let that sink in. And there are many other people like that. And so when a lot of these cases come to court, they're dismissed for reasons of national security. Because these slaves, these mind control slaves, are used for all kinds of purposes. Cathy was used as a drug mule to bring in drugs from Mexico. She was used as an assassin. She was used as a sex slave. She was used as a spy. And, okay, I've been reading a lot about, now most of their programming was done with words. And so, like I said, all those little cubby holes, to get one of the altars out, you had to know the code. And it may be something like the Wizard of Oz or something like that. But now, that all the new technology where they have these chips that they can put in and totally control your mind and your body, then they may be abandoning all these old techniques. And these techniques were already being supplanted by frequencies. And this is much harder to deprogram somebody because he had to learn how to access the different altars. And the different altars or personalities would sometimes get together and talk and have different ideas. Some of them remained isolated, some of them talked with the others, some of them were terrified of being killed, some of them were arsonists, and many times she had to stop. They would try to set her on fire.
Oh my goodness.
It was an utter nightmare all the time. So, does anybody have any questions that you want to ask about these things?
How could they set her on fire? If it was all in one body, though, right?
Yeah, they would all use her body.
But how could you set somebody on fire? I
And
guess you
most
could.
psychiatrists or psychologists that treat these people, and now there are many, many, many. I don't know if you ever heard of Jackie Damgard. Years ago, she was one of the earliest ones treating these people here. And back then, I didn't even know if I believed any of it. But the methods are so varied, but basically, up until maybe now that they have all this new technology with chips and mind control, the basic thing, they call it trauma-based mind control. They traumatize, they try to do children. They even start working on some children when they're still in the womb. You know, I hate to even mention this, it's so horrifying. At China Lake facility, there are cages
Where's
with
China?
babies in them.
Where is that?
Not Nevada. Out in
Huh?
Area 51.
Where's China Lake?
Area
It's
51.
out west somewhere. It's a military facility.
They have them all over.
Area
And they're
51.
programming, they
I got
start programming those babies sometimes when they're still in the womb or when they're first born.
Oh my God.
These children, what they would do, they would electrify the cage and keep torturing them. And then when they would see the father come, and they would think they were going to be saved, and then the father would brutally rape them. Now, why these people would harm their own children is, but
Well,
a
they're
lot
monsters.
of high
I mean, they're
level,
monsters. That's all there is to it.
what they call Illuminati families and all, do this to their children. What happens when a child is subjected to this is they basically become a genius. They develop very high-level abilities, and those abilities are used too. And there were times when Cathy had no idea that she was a slave. She didn't even know what was going on. Her mind was so tranced and so controlled that she wouldn't know where to start. She described one thing. She described how many country music stars are slaves, and that's how they get to the top, and some actresses and all too. But she describes being at Jensen, Missouri, which is a place, where a lot of country music stuff goes on, and Hillary Clinton coming in and raping her. She told me this herself to my face. She described in detail what happened. Okay, Cathy had been sexually mutilated. Her genitals had been carved into a hideous witch face. When Hillary came in, that was the first thing she wanted to see. And it turned her on big time. And Cathy said, she's the only woman that was ever turned on by my mutilation. Cathy had stun gun marks all over her body because that's one of the tortures. And that's where, once they've done their job, they stun gun and that wipes the memory so she doesn't remember anything. And so it was only through all these techniques helping them get back to normal that they're able to recover the memories. And there's so many stories like that in these books that is utterly, you can't even read very much of it. It's so horrifying and terrifying to think that thousands of children are being subjected to this today, this very minute. And it's ongoing. And if Cathy had just done, this is what they do. When they get about 30 years old, their usefulness wanes. And so what they do? They stuff them. They make a snuff film where they are murdered in the film. And that film is supplied to the high-level politicians so that they know they're safe then and nothing's going to come out. I mean, they thought of everything. There was a woman, this man that gave me the workshop in global sciences. It was like a 2-day workshop and very extensive to explain how it all worked. He had a woman there with him who had been rescued. But at one point, she tried to get me aside and wanted to talk to me. But then, after a while, she seemed to get frightened and was afraid to talk to me. And so there's so much mistrust among all these people. They don't know who they can trust. And when Mark Phillips, who was one of the bravest people I've ever known, he told me that over in Alabama, where they were living at the time, that they lived in a place called Arab, Alabama. And he said it was a relatively safe place. But he said in some counties, all the judges are compromised. So what they do is these people who are into all this stuff, they'll invite the judges and all these high-level people to a party. And then they'll find out what their perversions are first. And then they'll say, well, up on the second floor in the last bedroom, there's a little surprise for you. And it might be a little boy, or it might be a little girl, or whoever. And so they're secretly videotaped. So then they own that judge. And so nobody's going to get prosecuted there. There's a book, a famous book, came out a few years ago called The Franklin Cover-Up. Anybody ever heard of it? Okay. It was about the whole county was just full of all this corruption. And there were parties, they were flying children around from different places. Some children were being murdered. It was just horrendous. But there were these huge court cases. And in the end, this is what happened. All the judges were compromised and nobody went to jail. There were some famous people involved in it. I've got that book somewhere. I can't remember where it is right now, but there's many of these people have written their books. Now, David Icke's written some stuff that I have a lot of. I love David. He's a dear friend of mine. I took him to France to do workshops and everything. And I think he's one of the brightest people I know and seems to have a photographic memory for everything. But still, some of the later stuff he's come out with is so shocking that I don't know if I can believe it. He talks about, what's that woman's name? That he says performed all kind of rituals for the royals. I can't think of her name right now, but he knew. I never met her, but I've read about her, and I have a hard time swallowing, getting my head around all that. But there's another thing that says that a lot of these families, he says that they're reptilians. Well, there's something about this that I think may be true. You know, you're all familiar with Zechariah Sitchin and all that stuff, and about the Sumerians impregnating women and having children and actually creating us, so to speak. Well, all of his books describe that, and if you're not familiar with them, I suggest you read them because they're very well written. Yeah.
I've read every one of
You
Sitchin's
have to come
books.
up a little closer, I can't.
I have read every one of Sitchin's books
Yeah,
at least once, and there was never a mention of reptilians.
do you agree with him?
With who?
Zachariah.
I pretty much so, but he did not even talk about reptilians. There was nothing in any of his books about reptilians.
Oh, I know. But, I know that. But, I don't know, there may be a different interpretation. I'm not sure about that. But, there's something about that there's still a bloodline of those people. And some information that I had said that the reason that the Mormons were compiling these huge genealogies was because they were trying to collect the bloodline of Noah, the people that survived and developed after that. And of course, Zechariah talks about Noah. Here's a different name and all in that. So the reptilian thing is confusing, and I don't know. They talk about the royal shape shifting and all that stuff. I haven't gotten my head around all that yet.
Well,
But
Simon
David
Parks
talks at
talks
length about that.
Simon Parks talks about all the different
What?
Simon Parks.
What?
Simon Parks.
Oh yeah.
If you want to know more about,
Right,
he talks
right.
about the different.
There are a lot of people talking about it now. And it's another aspect of that. I got to know Zachariah pretty well. He was on a panel that I had at one time, and I took some workshops with him. A brilliant, brilliant man. And I don't dispute anything he said.
A lot of people do these days.
But-
They want some more research.
Of course, they talk about some of the researchers saying that not only did the whoever they were from Nibiru or whatever, not only did they help Noah, but that he had others in there with him, and that he was very advanced soul, and that they didn't take all the actual animals that they took. I don't know what they took, but something that so they could be reproduced. And so there's a lot of research about that. But it's interesting that's why the Mormons want all this genealogy, because several years ago they went to China and downloaded millions and millions and millions of genealogies from China. Now why? Why do they want that?
What do you mean downloaded What do you mean downloaded genealogies?
What did she say?
Records.
What do you mean? Put your hearing aid in.
She doesn't have it.
Put your hearing aid in.
What?
She wants to know what you mean by genealogies, downloading genealogies.
What do I mean by genealogy?
No, downloading genealogies.
Oh,
I'm
they
sorry.
put it in their computers. All these genealogies of all these Chinese, millions and millions and millions of them.
From a computer.
So,
They don't already have that in their system. They have to have it in their database, so it wasn't in
okay,
their
unless
database.
somebody
so-
has questions.
Yeah.
Try to come up close so I can't hear you. My hearing aid's not working.
So the idea is that that I've heard is that the reptilians need a certain blood type and metabolism in order to possess a human being, and so that could be related to why people will want
Well, one thing I recently
you
read
know,
was that
DNA information.
the negative, the RH negative was
Yeah.
could be alien,
Right,
and
that's all.
I know that
That's
in the
me.
normal population,
I wouldn't
that
admit
RH negative is something like 8%.
I read that.
In the Basque country, it is 60%. Think about that.
Wow.
The Bast?
And that's been used to say that that's a proof that we are not from animals and all, because there's no RH negative in the animal kingdom. But I've also recently said that it had to do with an alien aspect. And I haven't researched that enough to talk about it well. So.
How many other people here are O negative besides me?
What?
She wants to know how many people in the room are RH negative.
I thought she
Oh,
said
me.
O negative.
Oh.
O negative.
Anybody else?
Nope.
O negative. O negative is the universal donor.
Okay.
Maybe you're a reptilian.
Right.
Does that mean you're reptilian?
Absolutely.
And all reptilians aren't bad.
That's right.
That's exactly right.
I know. Some
They're not
reptilians
evil,
are very
no.
brilliant.
There you go.
Brilliant.
Most reptilians are very brilliant. You gotta watch them. That's what I've heard.
This
Never
woman
met one.
that wrote this book, did any of you ever meet Lawrence Perry?
Yes.
Yes.
Didn't he come here and
Yes, he
speak
came
one
here
time?
and spoke several
Well, he
times.
used to be a very good friend of mine, and he used to speak at Global Sciences, and he'd worked for the government. And so at one point, he was living up in Tryon, in Landrum, and this girl was not living with him, but she was his girlfriend, and she was working with him. Well, he had this beautiful antique house that his lab, and he treated people. He was wonderful. I thought he was. And it burned down. So they moved what they could salvage to her house. She had her own house. The next morning, there were bags of ashes on her front porch.
I remember that. Remember that
And
one?
so she was thinking that they would burn the house down because of her talking, and he thought it was because of the stuff he was telling, because he was telling stuff at Global Sciences about the EMF stuff and all the government was doing. So he told me that he contacted the FBI. I think he was really a spook. I think he's still connected to the intelligence community, is what I think now. But anyway, he said that the FBI told him this is an agency much higher than ours and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, as far as I know, I don't know what's happened to Lawrence Perry, and I don't want to know anymore. But
Yes, I was curious. Did you ever hear any more from him, Elaine?
at one point he was arrested for murder in
North Carolina area or something?
in Asheville because a client died, and I don't know whether that was put up job or what it was. But anyway, there are other things that I don't know what happened. Strange things, very strange things.
He was doing a lot of healing techniques.
Huh?
He was doing a lot of healing techniques.
Yeah, oh yeah, he was a wonderful healer. I liked it. But I think he definitely is a spook.
What does
He's
that mean?
connected to he's still a spy.
Spy.
Ask them. They know most of your answers. She can't hear you.
Any more questions? Okay.
Well, talk more about Lawrence Perry and why you think he was still a spook, and whether you think he was her handler.
What did she say, Berlin?
So talk more about Lawrence Perry.
What?
She wants to know more about Lawrence Perry.
And whether
Well,
he was her handler.
I don't
Whether
know
he
a
was
lot
her
about him.
handler.
I know after the house burned, he moved to Asheville. And he was doing acupuncture, and a child died that he took off of insulin. But her mother had been taking her to a lot of people and sort of dabbling around. And so he was put in prison for murder. But after a couple of years, they let him out. And then he moved back to Decatur, where he was from. And Usher and Dale Long and I went over there to see him one weekend. And he wiped out the whole weekend to treat us and work with us. But
In Decatur, Georgia?
Yeah, Alabama.
what?
Alabama, right?
Huh?
Decatur, Alabama.
We went, yeah,
Yeah.
in Decatur, Alabama.
Oh.
But there were some things that happened after that that I just don't want to go into. I don't know what happened. It was bizarre. So, Usher was living at Pine Lake, and she had some very strange things on her doorstep. Very strange.
That was
Weird.
The crows?
Bizarre.
The crows?
Huh?
The crows?
What?
The crows.
She can't hear you from back there. You
You
have
guys
to
are
come
gonna
out.
have to like walk up there and talk to
Just
her.
don't talk to her.
Just
Yeah,
go.
there you
You
go.
can sit up here. Wanna come sit up here?
So I don't know whatever happened to him.
Was that the situation with the crows? The birds
Which crows?
at Asha's house.
The birds.
Maybe, I don't know.
You don't remember?
A lot of weird things happen there.
You told me about dead crows.
Yeah. Well, a lot of dead animals were hanging on our doorknob. Things mutilated out and things like that. Strange.
And you think that had to do with him?
She saw it in there once.
Oh.
He ran away, she said. So I don't know. This is why I think he was still in the intelligence community. I couldn't trust him anymore, so I just didn't answer any email. I just backed out. But I had known him. I had spent the night at his house many times up there, taking people up there. Many people for years. My daughter, everybody. He was a good healer.
Seemed like a nice man.
He did.
He seemed like a very nice man.
Yeah. But I think he was compromised by the government in some way.
Here comes Kathy.
Could it have been?
What?
It's a hypothesis with a person like Lawrence Perry or others that even though they may do good things, that they themselves may have been mind controlled when they were younger, and
Oh,
so
right,
they could have
yeah.
been switched.
A lot of these
Not
people
that
are
I'm saying it's the truth.
are
It's just,
innocent in a way. I mean, they had no idea what they were. And some of these people didn't know that they had murdered people and done things until they went through all this recovery. And then they were horrified and felt so much guilt and everything because they found out they'd been used so much. So there's a lot in trying to help them remove the guilt and know that they're innocent. They were used.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Robin.
Hmm?
You said some of these people came to you for help. Were you able to help them?
Some of them, yes.
And how did you do that?
Well, various ways through regression and various things. A lot of the memories came up. But some of this was many years ago when I didn't know a lot about this at the time. There was one girl, did any of you know Elizabeth Brodowski? Anybody ever heard of her?
Yes. I've met her, yes.
Well, she's a psychic, and her daughter had some very bizarre experiences. She had gone to Israel and was in her school, and they evidently mind controlled her, and she just almost lost it totally. So I worked with her some, and there was some others, but early on, it wasn't so much known about it, and people are still finding. Most people have never heard of this stuff and wouldn't believe it if you told them. But I have known many of these people from global sciences that I got to know very well. And I know that, and so many of the stories in a lot, like Cathy Obrien and Cathy Sullivan's daughters both were named Kelly and were both abused by George Bush and Cheney. Oh, let me tell you, this is kind of raunchy, but a friend of mine had just read the story about Cheney, and when Cheney was going to take her off to the bedroom, the little girl, she was only 10. George Bush doesn't like girls over 10. And so when the Cheney was going to take her, she cried and screamed because her mother said he was so large that it was. So a friend of mine read that the next day, and then he saw this video, and this comedian, showed a video or a picture of Cheney with his legs spread. He had this huge ridge on his leg, and he said, "Look at the slung on that guy." Well, it's ugly, but it bears out that the child was terrified. And there was a special doctors that would have to treat her every time she was raped, both of the girls. And many children are subjected to this. And the doctors have to treat them every time. It seemed, I couldn't understand, David Icke and I had a discussion about this. Why are so many high-level politicians so, first of all, so highly sexed and so perverted? You got a name?
No, but it's politicians, it's church people, it's
Power.
corporation,
It's where there's
corporations.
power.
It's, you haven't said anything about pedophilia or pedogate, and that's what's in the news. Well, some of the news anyway now. Can you hear me?
Well, this guy, who was the guy that just either died or retired, the oldest man in Congress, Dr.
Thurman.
Senator
Ron
Byrd,
Thurman.
Senator Byrd.
Oh,
Okay.
Senator Byrd.
He was one of Cathy's handlers,
Oh,
and he would torture her and beat her and do all kind of things to her. He was a horrible person,
I don't doubt it.
and many of the others were
Bob Hope
enjoyed the torture.
I'm going to say that.
It was part of it. I mean, we live in a sick society, don't we?
Yeah.
Seems that way. Anybody else?
Huh?
Anybody else?
Brand, start bringing it to a
we got one.
close.
Wait,
Okay,
What?
one question.
Sherry
After
has
that.
a, wait, Sherry has a question.
Oh, Robin, is there anything, I mean, how can these people
Huh?
be helped? How are these people able to be helped?
Well, a lot of them don't even know they're slaves. They don't even know, so you can't help them if they don't know. And like Cathy was lucky enough that that this guy understood what had happened to her. One of the way they kept her enslaved was they made her work, kept her deprived of sleep and food, and worked her to death. And it kept her mind from ever coming back to normal in a way. Kept her in a semi-trance state almost all the time. And each one of these people's stories is different. But this woman, a lot of these stories took place right here in Atlanta, Georgia. she describes locations and addresses all over Atlanta where all these horrible things happen. And she describes names and places and people right here in Atlanta that she went through all this. It was so many years before she could trust anyone. She first contacted me when Bill Cooper, I had him come into Atlanta, and she called me because she read about him in the paper. And she called him and she called me, and she started telling me a lot of things that had happened to her, and I couldn't believe it. At first I was very skeptical, but she kept it up, and eventually I did have lunch with her one day, and then eventually she moved in with Lawrence Perry years later and wrote this book, and she came to Global Sciences one time, and she talks about how some of the grandparents, well, what happened was she was married to a dentist, and they ran a very successful, great big clinic, and she had no idea that she was laundering thousands of dollars of money through that clinic every week. She didn't even know that. And she didn't know her husband and her brother and her parents. This is all generational. Were all victims. And so she had an accident. She had a car accident, and it triggered something, so she started remembering things, and she was so horrified, and she kept trying to get therapy. She couldn't get therapy in this area because of her brother, her parents, and all were all in it. And so every time she would get therapy, they would sabotage them. So eventually she went to Hawaii, and she couldn't have any contact, phone, mail, anything with her family, anything until some of the deprogramming took place. And so this is what happens a lot of times when these people try to get free, is because their parents will be involved, their brothers and sisters and children. And so when she was working with Lawrence, I had lunch with her and her daughter one day. Her daughter was 16 and she had had breast implants. The mother didn't even know it. And so she bought this very expensive biofeedback equipment, and she went off to be trained in it, and she was going to put it in Lawrence's office, but she was going to use it mostly for her daughter. Well, while she was gone, the daddy got in touch with her and came and picked her up, and the last we heard, she was catatonic. And then it was soon after she came back that the house burned down. So there's so many bizarre stories. Sorry, I can't hear you. Hearing has gotten worse the last few weeks.
The next speaker will be Phil Sparks. That's what we think.
Okay.
Thank you, Robin.
Did everybody get one of the phones?